Good afternoon. Welcome to this first third Thursdays of the 2024-25 school year. I'm Janine Birchie Johnson. One of my roles here at AMBS is Director of Alumni. And we started this third Thursday webinar alumni conversation in 2020 during the pandemic. So this is beginning our fifth season of these webinar conversations, and we're very glad to have you join us today. The first couple of years of these webinars, we interviewed faculty and administrators at AMBS, and we've continued that until most of those folks have been introduced and had a chance to meet with alumni. Then we also started throwing in some sessions that were more focused on programs. This year, we're going to start with two sessions focusing on places at AMBS. And today, we are going to highlight the AMBS Prairie. I have two guests with me today, Norm Sender in green and Orion Blaha in blue, our maintenance staff, and they work very closely with our prairie. And so I've asked them to talk about that in just a bit. But first, I want to give a little bit more instruction. If you would please introduce yourself in the chat. Do that to everyone, not just to me. And then you can find out who else is here today. We are recording this session, so you'll be able to watch it later, or others will be able to watch it later on the website for the alumni page. And then also, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, you can put those in the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen. And when I get done sharing my screen, I will be able to look at those Q&A questions that have come in, and we will answer those near the end of our webinar. So I want to tell you a little bit about the library, the Prairie's history. When our Green Library was built in 2007, there was a major disturbance of the soil on our campus. There was a very, very large hole dug where they laid down the geothermal wells for the library. And all of that soil was to the east of where the library now is. And all of the soil from that hole was put on the north side of where the library now is. So when the soil was returned to that hole, we had a lot of land available, and part of the plan was to plant native prairie plants, grasses and flowers, with a higher percentage of flowers than you would normally find, just to make it more beautiful. And those were planted then as the library was finished up. So the beginning of our prairie can be dated back almost 15 years now. So, or more than, yeah, anyway, 15 years at least. So the first, we also had to get a variance from the city to put the prairie in, because the city requires grass to be kept mowed all the time. And so the variance allows us to have these unmowed areas. Although we do mow around the edges, the parts of our property that meet our neighbors are always mowed. Since we put in the 6 acres of planted prairie, we have now added to that other parts of our property that are left unmowed, and prairie plants have moved into those areas as well. Not as intentionally planted, so some of the plants are actually different than what we find in the planted prairie, but we have a total now of about 17 acres of unmowed areas on our campus. So that's been really neat to see the changes to our campus because of that. I did training in 2008 for the Indiana Master Naturalist Program. So we learned about prairies as part of that training. And since that time, I have monitored the prairie and cataloged the plants I found there. And we'll get to that near the end of our time together. I spend a lot of time teaching others about the prairie, whether that's our own students and employees or guests to the campus. We've had school groups and church groups come, and we've invited the public a couple different times to come for either gathering seeds or some kind of event that our prairie had. The students have somewhere along the line in the last few years gave me the nickname Prairie Godmother. And so I love to educate people about what's blooming in the prairie at different times of the year. So last year, Luke Gasho from Goshen shared an 1830 map of what is now South Elkhart overlaid with a current map. And you see that here. Luke and I are part of a group marking a Potawatomi Miami trade trail through the county. And this map that he gave us that shows that trade trail, the blue line across the bottom of the screen, is where that path from Fort Wayne to Chicago crossed our campus. And you'll see that it's just south of where our chapel is now. And the blue line that hooks up to the top of the screen is a spur trail that broke away on our campus there, really close to what's now Benham Avenue, and went up to what's now downtown Elkhart, where it met the St. Joseph River. So you can see right in the Y, the fork of that Y, the seminary's main buildings. And you can see the seminary's driveway kind of curving around. But notice the green line. Luke has marked that as the outline of Pleasant Prairie. There used to be a very large prairie covering what is now in a good chunk of what's now South Elkhart. And this is where Prairie Street got its name. It's where Pleasant Plain got its name, but it was called Pleasant Prairie. And when I first saw this map, I got goosebumps because the line of where the prairie started on the south edge of that prairie is exactly where our planted prairie starts. So we actually were restoring a section of this ancient prairie that the Potawatomi and Miami peoples would have crossed if they were heading up to the St. Joseph River. So that is really exciting to me. I want to start with some pictures that show how the prairie has changed over time. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures that go back to 2008, but in that first year of the prairie, it was primarily annuals that had been planted as cover crop, such as Timothy grass. There were some flowers as well, but we did not see the large prairie plants emerge right away because prairie plants develop first, mostly their roots, and then they start to develop their flowers or their shoots after that. So it took 7 years for some of the plants that had been planted to actually bloom. Not all of them, but it took some time for the prairie to develop. And you'll notice even in 2015, but it was more so before that, there was it seemed like there were more monocultures of different things. We didn't have the mix of different kinds of plants that we have visible now. So in summer of 2015, you can see a lot of yellow coneflower there on the north side of the prairie, on the north side of the library, and a nicer mix on the east side. This is the same summer. We're getting some rosinweed, but a lot of yellow coneflower. In late summer 2018, you're seeing a nicer mix. Some years we did not mow the prairie during the winter months so that it could provide wildlife cover. And this is one of those years in December. Usually the prairie gets mowed in the fall, like at the beginning of November before it gets too wet. I don't know, Norm and Orion, you want to jump in and talk about how you mow the prairie when you do that in the fall or when you did it in the spring? What all's involved in the mowing process?
with the fall mowing, we connect a bush hog to a tractor for the mowing, and it mows it down, but it mows it in a windrow. And then we cross mow it with the bush hog again to chop it up finer. Then we go back over it with a finish mower that would really break it up so the seeds fall to the ground and are able to go down to the ground but collect the moisture to either root themselves in the fall or sit dormant through the whole winter and then root themselves in the spring. The decision for how often to mow in the fall versus mowing it in the spring. When I first started here in 2012, it was mowed every year in the fall. And then after that current director moved on to a different job opportunity, Jeff Marshall, the director at that point, and I and Ron Ringenberg, plus Janine was involved, and there was a few others that we opened it up for a discussion as to how often to do it in the fall versus spring. And the detriment for doing it in the spring was that you have a greater possibility of putting ruts in the ground, and that would not be beneficial for a lot of the plants. So we came in that discussion, it came to a happy medium of mowing in the fall and then mowing in the spring on the 6th year. So 5 years mowing in the fall, the 6th year mowing in the spring. Then this past year, or spring, I should say, we had let it go all winter, but then we did a burn to the prairie, which had never been done.
Mhm.
And
And we're
so
going to
then
come to
we,
that soon. So hold
sorry,
those thoughts. So,
okay,
but mowing, as you said, does allow the seeds to grow, to come back into the soil. And it's important for prairie seeds to be stratified. So you need to keep them cold during the winter for them to have the best chance of germinating. So that's one of the benefits of mowing in the fall is those seeds land on the ground and are there either starting to germinate or waiting there. They provide food, of course, for a lot of creatures during the fall and winter as well. Um, so July of 2019, you can start to see a little more diversity. July is really the prettiest time of year to see the prairie. It's got the most color. And then here is before it was mowed in October of 22, the colors were just so beautiful that year. And then in the fall of 22, we had talked for a long time about um, marking some of the plants so that people would be able to see what they were and learn about them on their own without having to have a tour. So in the fall, we developed a plan for a path and put up these temporary stakes that marked some of the plants that we had worked on markers for. And the marker project was headed by one of our recent graduates, Andrew Hudson. He collected materials and went up to Camp Friedenswald and used their engraving machine. He had a bunch of people help him draw line drawings of the plants. And so this shows as we were staking out some plants to mark, and you can see on the left picture some orange paint. That was how I marked a possible path through the prairie that was then mowed by our staff. One thing I'll say about these yellow markers, it was a great idea, but by spring, all of my permanent markings had worn off, and we had to guess what plants were where. I had a little bit of notes, but I did not do a good job. So for the first year, we were kind of guessing and had to move some plants or move some of the markers around. But this shows the preparation for that. Norma or Ryan, do one of you want to talk about how you then created this path?
Yeah, so we We did mow a section of it, but the vast majority of the path installation was simply laying mulch very heavily at the start of the year. And then later on into the year, we had to uproot plants that had grown up through the mulch because the prairie plants don't care about mulch and they'll happily grow right through it. So the mulch served to mark the initial location, and then through careful uprooting, we cleared enough space to keep it open.
And this shows, you saw the path. This shows some of the plants emerging near their markers. And then by May, you can see how thick that mulch is. I think this is after you added another layer of it. It was interesting that some of the plants that came through the mulch bloomed much later in the season. So we had some spring flowers blooming in the summer in the middle of the path. But you can see the path winds through the prairie, and it allows people better access. I've always told people just plow on through, but a lot of people don't like kind of bushwhacking. So this path allows them to move through it. And this shows later in the summer, and some of those markers then telling people what we see. Okay, now we get to talk about the burn. This is a really exciting thing because the best way to help a prairie is to burn it. And this year we were able to do that. So I want to ask Norman Orion to talk about how you contracted to do this, what actually they did. What was this process like? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we asked around for recommendations, and Ryan Sensenig at Goshen College was a big help in finding a contractor. We selected Heartland Restoration for the burn management team, and they handled the paperwork, the permitting, and notification of various government bodies in order to pave the way for the burn. Then on the day of, they have to wait for the right conditions. March is the ideal time, but we had to push it into April this year because of rains and high winds. The wind needs to be not too high and in the correct direction for the fire path to move in the correct direction. The way that they manage the burn is that they have water sprayers and kerosene drippers that they can use to either retard the fire or encourage the fire in a certain direction, and they go by sections. One thing that we hope to do in the future is think about areas that we can burn on an offset rotation so that some areas remain unburned for a given year and other areas are burned. And that's in order to maintain habitat for some of the wildlife that does use that in the wintertime. The one issue with that offset rotation is that that introduces some additional mobilization costs. So we'll have to see how that fits into the burn rotation. And the generally accepted frequency is between 3 and 5 years for a burn of this sort. That was recommended by Heartland Restoration, although I understand some places burn more frequently.
So the two of you actually were there and were learning how to do this. Is the hope that you'll be able to do this on your own next time?
We discussed that possibility with Heartland Restoration, and one of the options they provided was to send some of their crew and still handle the paperwork so that if we had a volunteer crew, we would be better equipped to do the majority of the work ourselves, but also have the experience of the burn management team to ensure that everything is done correctly.
Great. Any other comments about the burn?
Because we had to do it so late in the year, I believe it was mid-April,
It was April
much
10.
of the, what's that?
April 10.
April 10, yeah. Because we had to do it so late in the year, much of the prairie had started to green up, and that contributed to a much more sluggish and smoky fire,
Hmm.
which we ended up receiving several fire department calls. I mean, several fire department trucks that people had called for because they were concerned about the smoke. Heartland Restoration assured me that usually when the conditions are better and it's not so wet and not so late in the year, the fire is much hotter and faster and there isn't so much smoke.
Okay, wow. So this is them finishing up their work. You're seeing pictures now of the east side of the prairie. And what they're standing on is actually the path that winds through, so that the mulch was not burned very much. But you can see some of the green that Orion talked about poking up through, but a lot of it did burn well. So
And
this is
if I
about,
may,
yeah,
if you back up one slide, the green trails that you see close to where the people are standing in yellow, Heartland Restoration said that those are game trails where animals have walked through and pressed the grasses down. So there are a number of places where you can see where likely a raccoon or something similar has walked through the grass to the base of a tree and then climbed the tree because there's a green line that goes straight to the trunk of the tree.
well, that's awesome. I didn't know that. That's great. So this is just 2 weeks later, and you can see on the left picture some of the plants that had started already that were scorched by the fire, and they're kind of re-emerging, plus a lot of other little beginnings of plants. The burn helps to remove this layer of thatch that had built up over years, and it makes it easier for these prairie plants to emerge. Prairie plants thrive on burned ground because their main bulk of their mass is under the ground, and so they are not killed by the fire. And some of the other invasive species that we don't want in our prairie are thwarted more by fire. So this is really helpful for the health of the prairie. I'm curious what the two of you have noticed this year. I'm going to show some pictures of how the prairie emerged over the next few weeks, but I'd love to hear you say what you noticed.
Well, an initial observation is that the grasses came in a lot heavier than the forbs, the flowering plants, earlier in the year. And although we are not currently tracking the composition of the prairie this year, my sense is that there are more grasses present, or at least more grasses grew thicker through the majority of the prairie than in previous years.
And we can definitely see that in this left picture. Those are the beginnings of the big blue stem. Before it sent its shoots up. These are all still within a month of the burn. I mean, everything exploded very quickly. And then by late June, well, I guess that would have been within 6 weeks. By late June, the path that you see here was getting really crowded. Things were growing into the path, and at one point, I had to ask for someone to come out and do some weed whacking so that we could get through. But you notice how vibrant everything is. This is Cheryl Zare and I trying to get through the path at one point, and I think this was the day we turned back because we just, but now the path has been cleared enough for people to go through it again. And then you see later in the season how dense some of this area is, how much variety of color there is, and then you start to see the end of the season. So thank you. Orion and Norm, do you want to say anything else about how you keep a prairie healthy, especially if you'd like to talk about the work that's done to remove invasives? Who's doing that? How is that happening?
We have a volunteer that comes once a week that does a lot of our landscaping grounds work, dealing with plants, beds, that type of thing, does transplanting. We, with summer crew, student help, we take a period of time that we try to go through the prairie and pull the invasive pear trees, either pull or dig them out. At one point, we didn't have the help and we would just clip them off at the ground. Well, then they come back with a multitude of branches. So we're better off actually taking a spade and going down and getting as much of the root as possible. And we try to do that through the year, but unfortunately this year we didn't have the quantity of student labor, so it hasn't been done. And so we've been looking at different ideas, and one option that was discussed between Orion and I was maybe during the Rooted and Grounded conference, to where those people could get a hands-on experience of the prairie, and everybody gets a shovel and we start looking for the invasive pear plants.
Yeah, the
But we haven't
calorie
talked to
pears
Janine
are the
about that
worst.
either.
That would be really cool. Calorie pears are one thing we've fought. Siberian elms are another one. Then some of the flowering plants, we've had different ways of managing those. One year we had a bunch of people out there clipping off the flowers because it was an annual, and if they didn't go to seed, we would hopefully, and we did knock that one back quite a bit. I'll show the picture of that later. They've also worked a little bit on sumac, right? Which could be native, but we don't want it in the prairie.
Right, right. Because the wells for the geothermal, we try to keep the trees out as much as possible. We have around the perimeter of the prairie put some smaller ornamental trees, just to have those up to give a little bit of a larger presence, but it doesn't inhibit the prairie grasses themselves.
Thank you. I'm also curious, just before we turn to the pictures of the different plants that we found, what would you like to say about how you sense that the prairie contributes to the overall campus? Like, what does it mean to have this ecosystem on our campus?
Well, a couple of ways that it actually helps the maintenance department and the overall budget is the fact that it reduces acreage of mowing. So we do not have the gas expense or fuel field expense, wear and tear on the mowers. It reduces that part of it. In turn, it creates larger plants for creating oxygen, just as trees do, but and it gives a community a beauty that they can actually look at also and benefit. And then with the new sidewalk that the city put in along Benham Avenue, it has allowed us to put some smaller trees that will get larger between that sidewalk and the prairie, but with the hope that over the course of time, the trees that we put in shade the sidewalk while people are walking, but it will be tall enough that they can still look in and see the prairie and the beauty that it provides.
Awesome. Orion, do you want to add anything?
I think that it's very special to be in the prairie. We've had some people from the community walking on the pathway that say they're from out of town, they're from the big city, and the idea of walking among some trees or walking in the wildflowers is totally new to them. It's a new experience. And I think that it's really special to be in that space. When I'm standing underneath the 7 or 8 foot tall big blue stem, I am reminded that I'm just a guest here and the prairie plants are forever.
Thank you. So that's a great segue, I'm going to turn to showing just briefly pictures of the different plants. This is not at all of the plants that we've found, but some of the more common ones. And I'm going to do that kind of in the order in which they bloom during a year. So in the early spring, things are just barely emerging. And then we get wild lupine, which is just gorgeous and is one of the food sources for the endangered blue darner butterfly. We get prairie phlox in different colors over mostly near the chapel. Wild white white wild indigo is one of my favorites. It looks completely out of place in the prairie because it's a big bushy plant. It's in the pea family, and it has these beautiful white stalks in the spring. And then later in the year, you see on the right, the seed pods develop and turn dark brown or blackish. Golden Alexander is now spreading into the prairie, but it was planted in the water gardens next to the library. And it's a plant that draws the water into the water table below. It absorbs that water and moves it down into the ground very quickly. It's a beautiful plant that blooms early, but the seed head stays there for the whole year and is quite beautiful. Bergamot is dominant in the early spring. This lavender, the bees and other insects absolutely love it. Foxglove beard tongue is a beautiful bloom in the spring, and then later in the fall, it has a really nice seed head. Spiderwort, one of the neat things about this plant is it blooms in the morning and then closes up, and then the next morning blooms again. We have lots of different kinds of milkweed, but butterfly milkweed is bright orange and very beautiful. The yellow coneflowers are a dominant flower in the summer, especially in July. Purple coneflowers are wonderful for attracting insects, but also just gorgeous. And these also are planted around the buildings. So we have their beauty both in the prairie and around the buildings. Prairie coreopsis blooms in early summer. Joe Pye weed on the left, that tall lavender color, and common milkweed is also, these would be midsummer flowers. This is the invasive flower that we had a lot of one summer about 6 or 7 years ago, and we had volunteers who went out and cut it off. We also had white sweet clover, which is invasive. So we still see a little bit of it, but not nearly as much. It's kind of looks like Culver's root, so you have to warn people not to cut this native flower that's very beautiful in the summer. Mountain mint, you can see how many insects are attracted to that. Rattlesnake master is another plant that looks out of place because it looks like a succulent that should be in the desert, but it's a really neat kind of spiky ball is the flower. Black-eyed Susans are a little shorter than the coneflowers. Wild quinine, it is a rubbery flower that kind of feels like cauliflower. Rosinweed, these plants get really tall. I tried to find a picture where you could see one clump of them, but mostly they grow in big masses and you don't see the whole plant like this so well. But the flowers on these are really pretty late summer. In that middle picture, you see one of our common insects in the area, a praying mantis there, looking for something else to come along to eat. Prairie dock. The picture on the left was when this plant first started to flower in about 2015 or 16. And first, we only saw these big basal leaves at the bottom. And then after that many years, the stalk finally came up. Now we have several of these plants scattered throughout the prairie. You can see the picture on the right, how the top is so tall that it often bends over, and the flowers look a lot like the rosinweed, but the stalk is completely different. There are no leaves on that stalk. Here you see ironweed, the purple flower on the left, and bush clover, kind of a whitish flower. These come late summer. Asters are blooming more in August and September. Here are some of the grasses, the big blue stem, the turkey foot bloom at the top, comes out late summer, August-ish. And Indian grass, switchgrass is very airy. We have a lot of that around the buildings as well. And then in the fall, in September and October, we have the blooming of goldenrod, the field goldenrod on the left and the stiff goldenrod on the right. Then we have some wildlife that is attracted by the prairie and other areas we have around campus. And then, oh, I was going to show on the left is a deer. Of course, we have several of those around. And on the right, this is just a couple of weeks ago, a flock of turkeys. They've been hanging out on the campus a lot, different years, but this year especially. And then to close our pictures, I want to show some pictures of groups that have visited the prairie to learn about it. This is both students and local church groups. We've had school groups, a school group come as well. We use the prairie for worship time. Sometimes we have outdoor chapel. Sometimes our employees go out just to enjoy the prairie during a break and come back with flowers for their offices. And here are some of our new students learning about the prairie during orientation week. It's not at its height of blooming in August when they come, but there's still enough for them to see. And here's some more pictures of students. This is during the Rooted and Grounded conference last year, where attendees spent time outdoors, just enjoying some part of creation. And this is this year, when we were in the spring, when we were out as the prairie was just starting to bloom. So I am going to end the screen sharing, and we have time now for your questions. And I've got one question that's come in here. How was the soil initially prepared for planting in 2008? Was it done in spring, fall, or winter? Okay, well, neither Norm nor Orion was here in 2008, and I don't actually know exactly what was done, but I think it was in the fall that the plants were put in. Some of them were put in as plugs where there was actually a plant that was planted. That was especially true in the water gardens around, like the areas around the buildings where we're trying to draw the water back in. It was important that those be put in as plugs. And then other plants were planted as seeds. And then there was a reseeding done the next year because they missed one area or didn't get it very thick. So they reseeded part of it. So thank you for that question. Are there other questions that you want to ask? You can do that through the Q&A. I see that Eileen Sainer has joined us. Eileen, as the former librarian who had the vision for the Green Library, was also one of the people who had this idea of doing a prairie around it. So we're grateful for her vision for that. I don't know, Eileen, if you want to jump in and chat and say anything more about anything that we've talked about that you have more insights, we welcome that. Are there other questions that you have? We have just a few minutes left.
I do know that, and this is hearing from the former director of maintenance at that time. He was the assistant when the prairie grasses went in. They spent 2 to 3 years of pretty intensive watering to get the prairie to start. And they would shift things and move things from area to area with the irrigation that they were doing. Then after the 3 years, they let it go on its own.
Okay, thanks. And we don't have to water the prairie now that the plants or the roots are established, because what I like to tell students, turf grass roots are about 4 inches deep. These prairie plants, the most shallow of the prairie plants roots are 12 inches deep, but some of those roots go as much as 15 feet deep. So they are drawing from moisture deep in the ground, and that's what helps them survive really dry times as well. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I want to thank, oh, Eileen did point. She thought was that we thought we had to do something to do less mowing because of the expense and how bad mowing was for the environment. And she had no idea it would develop into what you've just seen. So she's very grateful for the passion that we bring to this to keep the prairie healthy. And I am so grateful to both Norm and Orion and their volunteers for the work they do to make it possible for us to really enjoy this prairie. So thank you all for joining us today. Next month, we are going to learn about the Trinity House, which is a building that was just renovated on the edge of our campus to be a retreat place for people. The Trinity House was originally built by Clarence and Alice Bauman, and they called it the Poustinia. And you might remember this very distinctive house with three round parts, 3 round rooms connected in the center. And next month on October 17th, Alan Rudy Froese is going to join me. We'll see a video of a tour of the Poustinia, now Trinity House. And then Alan is going to share some memories of Clarence and Alice Bauman. And it will be really neat for you to see how this has now become a place where visitors to campus, as well as our own students, can do retreats in this place. Thank you so much for joining. Yes, and it is, we cannot have the event in the Trinity House because there is no internet there intentionally. And so we will have a video that we show you a tour of the place and talk about it, but you won't actually get to have Alan and I in that space when we talk about it. Thank you so much for your support of AMBS. Remember to tell others, especially young adults who might be thinking about what they do next, to consider seminary. Thank you for your financial gifts to AMBS. Our alumni are so important as influencers and supporters of what we're doing here. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.